Death and disability stalk men and women in the Persian Gulf War. Hello and welcome to another edition of DNet, the Disability Network. I'm Joe Coughlin.
And I'm Susan Pettit. The Gulf War has raised the specter of thousands of people, soldiers and civilians, spending the rest of their lives disabled.
Does Canada have the means to care for and rehabilitate men and women wounded in Gulf fighting? We will put that question to a rehabilitation specialist who has seen Gulf War casualties firsthand.
More people are buying into the idea of making buildings and open spaces accessible to the disabled. We'll meet two experts in the field.
And we'll meet the feisty, no-nonsense head of the Canadian Hearing Society. But first, here is our roundup of disability news.
Canadian casualties from the Persian Gulf War will disrupt rehabilitation services in Canada. That's the contention of Dr. Charles Godfrey of Toronto, a specialist in rehabilitative medicine. Godfrey says there are not enough facilities to deal with the kinds of injuries a Gulf War will bring home.
We haven't got the personnel. We can't even take care of the people in our society now who require rehabilitation. There are literally dozens of people who are shoved off from the process because there's simply not room for them. Eventually, I think, as happened in World War II, we'll be able to build up a fair cadre of personnel who can do that, but that'll take time, and currently we haven't got those people in process of being trained.
We will talk with Dr. Godfrey and a CBC medical reporter later in the program.
The federal government has established a new job training board, and the disabled community will have a voice on it. The new Labor Force Development Training Board will include one representative from the disabled community, chosen by the community. Business and labor will have 8 representatives each. The board will make the decisions on how billions of dollars in training funds will be spent. But already there are problems. The Quebec government has indicated that it will have nothing to do with the program, and it's too early to tell how that will affect disabled persons in Quebec.
Lon Delgado wants to get married, but he's being held back by a bureaucratic problem that a lot of disabled people are coming up against. Delgado is quadriplegic. Under Ontario's Family Benefits program, he gets income and medical benefits he can't live without. They are benefits he would lose if he gets married. His fiancée, Joanne Vandersteen, works as a registered nursing assistant, but doesn't earn enough to replace those benefits. Delgado is optimistic, but it's a no-win situation that he finds very frustrating.
I fought hard to rehabilitate myself and come out of the hospital. That was a great savings to the government, no matter how you look at it. I was out of the, I'm not holding down a chronic bed anywhere, and I live out here in the community. I'm trying to be, and all these things welled up inside of me, where they say go out and live and don't hide yourself away, and right away they threw this block at me.
Government spokespeople acknowledge that the situation is inequitable, but are unable to say when Ontario's new NDP government may change the legislation.
Researchers are developing new ways for diabetics to lessen their dependence on insulin. Linda Steele brings us this report from Edmonton.
Simply put, the new therapy involves extracting millions of islets or insulin-producing cells from a healthy human pancreas and transplanting them into the diabetic patient. The patient's body is then able to start producing its own insulin, decreasing but not eliminating the need for daily injections.
This would not be called a cure. This is called an improved method of therapy.
Trouble is, the new method has its limitations. To work, the patient also has to take anti-rejection drugs, which can have nasty side effects like abnormal hair growth. So for now, only patients already on the drugs are being considered for therapy.
It's just like a whole new life just opened up for me.
These two Edmonton diabetics were Canada's first ever islet transplant patients. Both received the treatment this spring after undergoing kidney transplants. They say it's made a big difference in their lives.
It's very encouraging. It's not a miracle cure or anything like that. It's a really positive step towards something like a cure.
And a cure may not be too far off, according to Dr. Ray Rajat.
Our ultimate goal would be to essentially take the diabetic completely off insulin. So we would increase the number of islets that essentially you wouldn't have to take no insulin at all.
But for now, doctors are concentrating their efforts on helping the 10% of people who are considered type 1 diabetics, patients who would die without regular insulin injections. Type 2 diabetics who need insulin only once in a while will have to wait maybe years for further developments. Linda Steele, CBC News, Edmonton.
And that ends this week's roundup of disability news.
Coming up next, death and disability in the Gulf.
The pictures from the last war in the Persian Gulf between Iraq and Iran are horribly familiar. Hundreds of thousands of people died in that war, and thousands more were permanently disabled. The most deadly weapons ever used greatly increased the number of casualties.
Dr. Charles Godfrey, a rehabilitation consultant at Toronto's Wellesley Hospital, spent 8 days in Iraq visiting Iraqi veterans of the First Gulf War. Typical war casualties he saw were spinal cord injuries, thousands of amputees, burn victims, and many people with mental disabilities. The overwhelming number of veterans, he said, are amputees and paraplegics. Dr. Godfrey says fragments from modern shells produce shrapnel 1,000 times more mutilating than shells used in Vietnam.
Earlier this week, before war broke out, Joe talked with Dr. Godfrey and Trish Wood, who is the medical reporter for the CBC radio program As It Happens. Wood has taken a detailed look at medical preparedness in the Gulf, talking to experts in the field in Washington and elsewhere.
Ms. Wood, if a soldier in a potential Gulf crisis, a Gulf war, is injured, how do the people that go in and rescue these people get them out quickly so their injuries don't become disabling conditions?
There is a sense, I think, when people look at this issue you've raised, that we'll be dealing with the same set of rules and circumstances that we did in Vietnam. And what I have been told by people in the Pentagon who've been studying this is that it's not going to be that way at all. It's going to be a completely different situation. Vietnam, for wounded soldiers, worked rather cleanly. The medevac process worked rather cleanly, if such a thing can be said about a war situation, and I'm told that it's not going to be that way in the Gulf at all. They're going to be seeing all kinds of problems getting the wounded men and women out of there.
Well, explain what it is cleanly in the Vietnam situation and juxtapose it with the Iraqi situation.
Well, what American troops had going for them in Vietnam is that it was a long, narrow country. The enemy that they were fighting, namely the Viet Cong, did not have sophisticated anti-aircraft weapons, so they were able to call in quite quickly and quite safely under most circumstances a helicopter to come in, get the wounded soldier out, and get them into a medevac hospital. There are cases after cases that I heard of people who were catastrophically wounded, would have died on the battlefield had the circumstances been any different, and were able to be medevaced out to an evacuation hospital within sometimes 20 minutes, half an hour of being wounded. In the Gulf, we're not going to see that for a variety of reasons. Number one, the geography there is vast. That desert that there is going to be the theater for this, if it happens, is as big as the United States east of the Mississippi. It's a large, large area for these medevac choppers to get in and out of. Some of them, frankly, don't have the range. The other problem is that the Iraqis have sophisticated anti-aircraft weapons that will be aimed probably at these helicopters. We have no reason to believe that they wouldn't be. The third reason is that when you've got, I'm told, all of these forces working together, things are going to be popping. They may be under an artillery bombardment at the time. The radio signals to call in a helicopter medical evacuation, which is the most efficient way to do it, they may not be able to get that radio call out to get the helicopter in. So they're going to be facing all kinds of strategic problems in getting those people out. I was told by someone at the Pentagon that they're talking about moving their people out of the forward lines into the backward lines of the theater, where they can get treatment in a field hospital, at least by armored personnel carrier, which is not the most efficient nor humane way to be moving wounded troops.
Dr. Godfrey, given this situation, are we prepared back here in this country to accept these people who have been catastrophically wounded in this conflict and rehabilitate them enough to get them back to work?
Not with our present facilities. It'll require a massive rethink of rehabilitation. Currently, we do not have enough rehabilitation facilities for the current casualties. There are many people who don't get full treatment, who are sloughed off before they're back to their place in society where they should be. So it'll be necessary for the entire country to rethink rehabilitation. The veterans, of course, will be given priority, which is natural. But that means that the civilian people who require rehabilitation, the paraplegics, the head injuries, won't have priority, so we'll have to expand what we're doing. This will take training of more staff immediately, the opening of more facilities immediately. The hardware is not that difficult. It's the staff where we are grievously lacking.
We're going to see some different kinds of injuries than we saw in the last war that we have rehabilitated people in, and that was the Second World War. How are we going to cope with those different kinds of injuries in this war?
Well, we'll still see the paraplegics, we'll still see the terrible gunshot wounds because of the quality of the armaments they're using now. The injuries will be far more mutilating. We will see possibly more burn victims, certainly if they use mustard gas more effectively. But the general run of things, the fractures, the gunshot wounds, will be pretty well what they were the last time. Now, our ability to take care of those has improved considerably since even the Vietnam War. The patients I saw in Iraq when I visited there a year ago, they had received far better treatment than the Vietnamese veteran got once they could get into the centers. So we'll have to upgrade all of our facilities.
Dr. Godfrey, Ms. Wood, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.
Dr. Charles Godfrey is a rehabilitation consultant at Wellesley Hospital in Toronto. Trish Wood is the medical reporter for CBC Radio's As It Happens.
After the commercial break, we'll meet two women who will tell us how to make our offices and homes barrier-free. There's a common term in film and in television when an item has been committed to tape. It's called in the can. Well, we're in the can too, but this is a slightly different situation. This is the washroom at our offices at the CBC, and it has been retrofitted to accommodate somebody in a wheelchair. The CBC hired the Barrier-Free Design Center to show them the best way to make this washroom facility usable for people with disabilities. The architects, designers, and consultants who work for Barrier-Free Design share a single philosophy. It is, says the center's executive director, Ann Adams, a belief that barrier-free means independence and integrity for everyone.
It doesn't mean, as we used to say, design for the handicapped, which was a segregated design approach. It meant we designed this special way for these special people and a regular way for normal people. Barrier-free design accepts that all kinds of people will use a building in many different ways, and it makes it safe and comfortable and dignified for everyone.
Is it aesthetically pleasing, though? I've seen
a very important element.
Yeah, I've seen some places that are designed with handicapped people in mind or disabled people in mind, and it kind of looks like a hospital.
That's unfortunately how we started out. A lot of the suppliers of a simple thing like grab bars will make them chrome, will make them ugly because they're going to be used in institutional settings. Well, nowadays we use grab bars all kinds of places. There are many elderly people, for example, who can really benefit from a grab bar in their home, around the bathtub, safer getting in and out. Well, nobody wants something that's ugly and institutional. So slowly, even the suppliers of those sort of products are recognizing that people have a high need for aesthetics in the home and in the workplace.
Toronto's high-tech sports palace, the Sky Dome, was a barrier-free design client. It is one of their many corporate customers. The special seating, the wheelchair ramps, the special elevators, and parking were built with the help of barrier-free consultants. Julia Bork is the manager of design consultation for Barrier-Free Design. She says she has little trouble persuading contractors to make their buildings accessible. It is the outside of buildings that cause problems.
Most people get the objects right. The sink, the knee clearance, underneath the sink, all the things that are prescribed in the Ontario Building Code. You look it up. That's great. You can, they're easy to find, and they tell you exactly what they want. But I look for the accessible route. How does somebody get from A to B? The door is wide enough, but there was no law that said you couldn't have a step here, or the distance from the parking space to the elevator, was 300 feet. Why? Why is that? So I generally look for that sort of thing. What makes the route accessible rather than what are the objects along the route? Burke
says most new buildings have wheelchair ramps, but other barriers remain. Expensive but slippery marble floors are one obvious example. A not-so-obvious example, reflective surfaces.
Well, visually impaired would have a tremendous problem with a reflective surface, with seeing a sign that's on a reflective surface, with just the confusion when there isn't high contrast. If if the door is the same color as the wall, where's the door? How do I spot the entrance? Is the door hardware, is it in contrast with the door? If you can't find it, you can't get in. If you can't see the door handle, you can't get in the building. Those sorts of things. I mean, they're very important for people with visual impairments. Well, as well for anybody with a cognitive impairment, or, and the elderly tend to have some sort of a visual impairment. So it's important that these things be done for an aging population.
Viewers will remember that our consumer test of a ramp at one of Toronto's newest office towers passed with flying colors. This particular building appeared to be a model of accessibility. A landlord who is not so accommodating, and we find this a surprise, is the federal government.
Recently, the Canadian Human Rights Commission sponsored a study to test federal buildings across the country. Federal buildings have been required to establish plans for accessibility and actually get some of it done. For 5 years now, they've had this policy in place. The checkup that was done last summer showed pretty dismal results.
Ann Adams doesn't accept only big money clients such as Skydome. Small companies, families, even individuals can get help from barrier-free design. And the cost of the service? Well, it varies according to who's asking.
The service is, design consultation is based on an hourly rate. Many projects will probably start at, say, $500 to $1,000 for a design review. That's a very small portion of an overall building cost. We like to say you can either look carefully at this now or spend a lot more money later on changing your building. Many of our other services are free of charge to everybody. We run an information service that this collection here is the basis of, and we're able to take research questions over the phone, generally turn around within a day or two, and that service is provided free of charge.
The address of Barrier-Free Design is 2075 Bayview Avenue, Toronto, Ontario, M4N 3M5.
Next, straight talk on the goals of people who are deaf and hard of hearing. Due to a technical glitch, our recently aired profile of the first deaf president of the Canadian Hearing Society, Kathryn Woodcock, was not closed captioned. Here it is again, and we pray the closed captioning doesn't break down as it did when we first ran the story, which begins here at the CBC.
Deaf students in Ontario say they're not getting a fair deal in education, and today they marched on the provincial legislature to demand change. The issue is communication. The deaf want to be taught in their own language. They say that's not happening right now, not in Ontario or any other province. Cass Rusi reports.
About 300 deaf protesters and their supporters beat the drum on a wet afternoon in Toronto for the right to equal...
Deaf and hearing impaired Canadians are getting to be very good at attracting media attention. Television in particular has given a lot of airtime to the demands of deaf people for a better, more independent life. The public demonstration has been a particularly effective tool in bringing the needs of deaf and hearing impaired persons to the attention of government and the public at large. One deaf person who is clearly mistress of her own house is Kathryn Woodcock, the first deaf president of the Canadian Hearing Society. Woodcock, who has become progressively deaf, says she is not frightened by the world of the deaf.
I don't find the deaf world a frightening thing at all. A lot of hearing people say, oh, being deaf must be the worst thing in the world. It's the worst possible disability you could have. Maybe I'm naive, but it's almost kind of fun for me. I mean, I have finally found a world that is accessible to me. The way that the deaf community communicates is accessible to me after years of trying to get into the hearing world and make my way through the hearing world. And now I find that the deaf community communicates in a way that matches my abilities, and that's not frightening for me. That's liberating.
In your efforts and accomplishments,
a professional engineer, Kathryn Woodcock is receiving a scholarship that will enable her to continue her university studies. It was in May of 1990 that she was elected by the Canadian Hearing Society as its first deaf president.
I think the most important thing I can do, I mean, this is fairly early in my term as president, but I think the most important thing I can do is be, for want of a better word, a role model to show people that there's nothing exceptional about a deaf person being the president of the society. It's perfectly possible, it's plausible, and it's effective. A meeting can be chaired that involves both deaf and hard of hearing and hearing people, can be chaired by someone using sign language, and that other people will understand what's going on in the meeting perfectly well, that the due rules of order can be followed, motions can be made and seconded, and minutes taken. So it's sort of a model in that respect, and that other consumers can look at that and say, well, if she can do it, I can do it.
These are students from Washington's University for the Deaf, Gallaudet. 2 years ago, in an action that attracted worldwide attention, Gallaudet students successfully campaigned for the election of the university's first deaf president.
I think that the deaf people at Gallaudet weren't asking for somebody's endorsement to say yes or no, could a deaf person do it? They knew a deaf person could do it, and now they wanted the recognition that a deaf person could do it. So within the Gallaudet community, it had its value, but in the larger deaf community, it also said, if they're listening at Gallaudet, what else can we do?
Speaker is pleased to recognize the member for York East.
I am truly honored and privileged to move the adoption of the speech from the throne.
As significant in some ways as the Gallaudet Revolution was the election to the Ontario legislature of Gary Malkowski. And there, aiding Malkowski was his interpreter, something that had never happened before in a Canadian legislature.
Now we have in the Ontario legislature a deaf person representing the needs of hearing people. That's what we want to see. We want to see the needs of deaf people being represented by deaf people, the needs of hard of hearing people being represented by hard of hearing people. And we want the hearing community to look at that and say, it's legitimate for us to represent our own interests. I think that's a message that goes across all communities of people with disabilities, is that we can't let other people tell us what our needs are. The professionals are very helpful, the social service agencies, the parents, that do a wonderful job at what they do. But only we know our real needs, and only we can advocate effectively for our own interests.
And finally, letters from viewers. This first letter comes from Mrs. Addie DeGraff, who lives in Manitoba. She is writing in response to the item we did on traveling. I have 2 Down syndrome teenagers, and we travel long distances on Greyhound buses. I applied to obtain a special ID card to travel free as a chaperone, but the questionnaire needed to be answered and signed by a doctor and only applied to the physically handicapped. It would be nice if Greyhound Lines could alter their rules and change their certificate of eligibility to make the questionnaire applicable to the handicapped, both physical and mental.
And this is a letter from Nancy Hansen of Ottawa. Keep up the good work. Television shows that treat disability issues in such a professional manner are rare. DNET illustrates that the electronic media is finally coming of age in its treatment of disability and disability rights issues. You know, we like getting positive letters, but if you don't like something about the show, we'd like to hear from you too. Susan?
Our address is the Disability Network, CBC Box 500, Station A, Toronto, M5W1E6. Our fax number is area code 416-975-5636.
And that's DNET for another week. I'm Joe Coughlin.
And I'm Susan Pettit.